following is an in-depth analysis. If you haven't seen this movie, you might want to before watching this review. I can't believe The Amazing Spider-Man is already old enough to be reviewed on Superhero Rewind. I had no idea the onslaught of superhero movies was going to turn into a full-on invasion on that fateful day when I vowed, like I had some kind of sacred responsibility, to review every superhero movie ever made. Like Peter's quest to discover what happened to his father when he gets more than he bargained for. I've spun my web, and now I've got to hang in it. A lot of fans were more than a little miffed that this series was rebooted so quickly and that the Raimi films didn't get an arguably deserved chance to redeem themselves. Sure, most of us would agree that Spider-Man 3 was a mess, but Spider-Man 2 was so almost universally praised that a lot of folks thought the series was still salvageable and wanted to see Raimi make up for all that convoluted plotting of the last film. Me personally, after reading about some of the preliminary ideas for Spider-Man 4, including the introduction of one of my least favorite Spider-Man villains, the Vulture, and bringing in Felicia Hardy not as the Black Cat, but as a character called the Vultress, maybe it's for the best that Raimi chose to bow out and give somebody else a shot. Not to mention that I think Peter was verging on irredeemable, and I'm not sure what another film could have done, even if it was aware of that character damage, to make me really root for him again, beyond just pretending like a lot of it didn't happen. I'm not sure how often Sony has to make a Spider-Man movie in order to keep the rights, but it's such an enormous moneymaker for them, nobody should have been surprised that they opted to reboot in almost the time it would have taken to release a fourth installment. Now, I've always said that there are a lot of different approaches to superhero characters, and I don't mind seeing new versions every so often. Even with Marvel characters who have been locked in the same continuity since their inception and aren't rebooted constantly like DC's heroes, every time a new writer and artist gets their hands on a character, it becomes their interpretation. And so there are numerous approaches and styles and angles. If we keep releasing drastically different variations of Spider-Man on television, then why not let somebody else reinvent it when Raimi decides he's finished? I think people resisted such a quick reboot, myself included, because we have to switch gears so suddenly. People were invested in these characters in this story, and now we have to forget all that and start over. Not to mention, we have to sit through a retelling of a specific story we feel like we just saw not that long ago, and that feels maybe unnecessary. Oh, and I feel really bad for Dylan Baker, who patiently waited to finally play the Lizard through the last two movies, and then the whole thing got rebooted before he had the chance. The rumor was that was also supposed to finally happen in Spider-Man 4. Tough break, pal. Way back in 2010, my 12th episode of Superhero Rewind was a review of Sam Raimi's first Spider-Man film, and the focus on what I wanted to see in the then newly announced reboot based on what didn't quite work in that film. As much as I'd like to review this film completely on its own merits, it's going to be impossible not to compare it to what came before for obvious reasons. It's greatly affected by the fact that it's covering recently adapted material, and it feels even more recent since Spider-Man 3 retroactively added more material to that franchise's origin, and that material clearly influenced a lot of choices made here, both in what was added and what was left out. I will analyze the story on its own, of course, but I also want to explore how the films measure up to each other, because, after all, what's the point of another Spider-Man origin 10 years later if it doesn't make any improvements? Perhaps it's not totally fair, but I think the success of something like this does at least partially ride on how it stacks up to the last franchise, particularly if it wrapped up in such a commercially successful place. It has to work a lot harder because the first time around, a movie could coast a bit on the novelty of finally getting to see a big-budget Spider-Man swinging around the city. That novelty is worn off now, and this thing has a lot to prove in justifying its own existence. So just for fun, let's take a trip back in time and revisit what changes I was hoping to see and then find out how The Amazing Spider-Man did. I want Peter Parker, even if he's going to be in high school again, to have already been Spider-Man for a while before the film even opens. The reboot needs to keep it lighthearted. Even when he feels he's the cause of them, the best Spider-Man is the one who uses humor to deal with tense situations.
Bam! Just like that.
Oh, and about Jameson, whoever is cast next, I hope his part doesn't turn into a cameo. In fact, I'd like him to be more involved in the main story. I want a Peter Parker who is more proactive.
Bam! Just like that.
I would really like to see a Spider-Man movie without Mary Jane. I've heard a lot of people already say they'd like to see Gwen Stacy done right and be Peter's first girlfriend like she was in the early comics, and I think maybe I'd like that too. Bam! Just like that. Now, I don't think they should do Goblin again in the next movie, because that's one of the things that was actually done pretty well here, and it's too soon. Bam! Just like that. This film has a good grasp of what Peter's values are supposed to be, and that's something the next movie should definitely hold on to. Bam! Just like that. I do want to see him doing more science in the reboot. I think going with traditional web shooters rather than organic webbing would be a good step in that direction. Bam! Just like that. Oh, and I also want a realistic reason for that costume this time. Harry and Peter's relationship is genuine, and I want something like that in the reboot. And Webb decided to save that for next movie, so we'll revisit that when we cover Amazing Spider-Man 2. 6 out of 10, wow, that's not bad. And most of what I was hoping for that it didn't do were minor, inconsequential things. But it managed the really important stuff, believably jokey yet still complex and conflicted Peter Parker, a good handle on the moral values and responsibility lesson, much less superficial and watchable love story, and a new villain with a less random and senseless kill-everyone-for-no-reason plot. Although Connors is not altogether an antagonist with more depth than Norman Osborn was, and I think his characterization is the biggest missed opportunity in this film. As for the origin, Webb makes a pretty convincing case for retelling that story by making this a teenage romance and coming-of-age story before it's a superhero movie, and the best moments in the film are the tender and real moments with Ben, with Aunt May, and the development of Peter's chemistry with Gwen. These couldn't really exist without revisiting origin. Now, I could almost just leave the review off right there, but let's delve into some things, shall we? Let's start right at the beginning, with the mystery of Peter's parents. I both really love that move, and I also really hate it. At first glance, it feels like a ploy to complicate things unnecessarily in order to justify doing the origin again. Like Man of Steel, The Amazing Spider-Man doesn't pretend like it's doing this character for the first time. It feels like an alternate version, informed by what's come before, and with a tone of misdirection that expects audiences to have seen those movies and hopes to impress us with what's different. It feels the need to start back at the beginning in order to carve its own identity, and I would imagine so as not to confuse viewers that may have not gotten the memo that this isn't the same continuity as before. In his commentary on the film, Marc Webb, who clearly got the job because he has the appropriate last name, I'm sure it has nothing to do with his experience in telling a compelling love story, he calls Spider-Man a titular character who deserves to be on screen and whose backstory is worth revisiting. He says this with absolute conviction. I don't know if it was mandated by the studio as I might have expected, but he clearly believes there were new ideas to mine here. The tagline on the movie posters was The Untold Story. The strategy seemed to be trying to entice people with a new origin so they wouldn't think it was the same thing all over again. Maybe a smart marketing move, but I find that tagline a little strange. Usually when I see the phrase Untold Story, it's like a missing or hidden chapter in an already established world. You thought you knew everything, but now find out what really happened. Smallville didn't call itself an untold story or even a prequel. It called itself a reimagining, because that's what it was, especially since the untold part isn't really source material that was left out of the last continuity, but a brand new heritage spin on the whole thing. It has some commonalities with the Ultimate Universe version of Peter's parents. This movie borrows quite a bit from Ultimate, by the way. Richard was a geneticist there too, but rather than engineering the spider that bites Peter, he creates the beginnings of the Venom symbiote. It did always strike me as odd that Peter has one line in the original film to Osborn about living with his aunt and uncle instead of his parents, and when he's arguing with Uncle Ben outside the library, he tells him to stop trying to be his father. But it's left entirely ambiguous as to what happened to his parents and why he wasn't raised by them. Here, it's actually used in a pretty sophisticated way to flesh out Peter's psychology before he's bitten by the spider. Everything about him is a lot more natural, and his lost and unsure personality all comes from more specific places. He's had a good upbringing, and the scene with Flash toward the beginning, where he risks himself to help a kid who's being bullied, demonstrates that he has a good heart and a natural tendency to help people, even if he'll sometimes lose his way. But something is missing. His mother and father raised him during some of the most crucial years of personality development. Importantly, he remembers and misses his dad, and he's a lot like him, brilliant, scientifically minded, passionate, driven. It's as if his father handed him a complex tool, his mind, but he couldn't get around to giving him the instructions. In the original film, Peter just uses the fact that Ben isn't his real father to do something foolish. Here, he has a real reason to feel lost without his father's guidance, even though he has a wonderful father figure in Ben. We're given example after example of how Ben and May do their best, but they're just not equipped enough to give Peter all that he needs. Like when Ben says that he hasn't been able to help Peter with his homework since he was 10. In the same scene, Peter calls Ben a great dad. I love Ben's reaction, and I believe it when Peter says that. This is one of the most genuine parent-son relationships I've seen on screen. The way Ben understands Peter's disregard for authority and thirst for adventure, but also the way he doesn't tolerate his shirking of responsibilities and May's stern, no-nonsense attitude, but also her overprotective nature. And I like that Peter is trying so hard to be a good son to them, but he's distracted when he starts to think the world is suddenly giving him everything he's ever wanted. A lead on what happened to his father, incredible physical abilities, a girlfriend. And overwhelmed and elated at the same time, he gets cocky and overconfident. Peter is already special before he gets spider powers, and Ben and May feel like the Kents trying to raise an amazing boy they can't possibly understand way before super science is even involved. I love that. Superpowers become an extension of Peter's natural talents and are actually fully related to those talents. He already has an ability that serves as a blessing and a curse. His penchant for science likely gives him a bright future, but it also leads him into trouble when he gives Dr. Connors a dangerous formula without understanding its implications. He's looking for guidance because, like most teenagers, he's becoming an adult and he doesn't know what to do or who to be. On paper, Peter's parents' disappearance is an excellent catalyst to naturally start Peter down the path to becoming Spider-Man. I like the idea that the power and responsibility lesson don't come because he randomly gets superpowers. Now, that's not to say that coincidence never happens and that it doesn't play a profound role in people's lives, but Spider-Man's story has always been one of actions and consequences. I like that he isn't special because he gets spider powers. In this version, he gets spider powers because he's special, because of the kind of person his father helped shape him into before he left. Peter's quest is about finding his father, but the larger goal is figuring out who he is. A motivation cleverly punctuated in the scene where he's trying to sneak into Oscorp, and the lady at the desk, as he's pretending to look for his lanyard, asks if he's having trouble finding himself. Peter is also naturally curious about science and how things work. He's found this decay rate algorithm his father was working on, and because he has his father's natural curiosity, he has to discover what that's all about. His father's curiosity led him on some mysterious and horrible path that put him at odds with Norman Osborn and forced him to leave his home and his child in the name of doing the right thing, a chain reaction, which we learn more about in the sequel, but I won't speak to here. This film is a little tough to analyze independently because some of the story threads aren't closed yet. And here, Peter makes a choice, seemingly harmless enough without thought to or an understanding of the consequences, and it starts him on a never-ending cycle of responsibility. Whether you look at it as a mistake or a necessary journey he had to take no matter what happened to him, in this version, the spider bite is the result of the first fateful choice Peter makes, and that starts the domino effect that leads him to his eventual power and responsibility credo. And interestingly, the spider powers are weirdly inherited from his father, so it's just the next row of dominoes lined up right behind the last one. But importantly, he has to knock those dominoes down through a choice. Even though what exactly his father did is left a mystery here, the parallels between Richard and his son are clear. Each makes mistakes that profoundly define them, which build their moral character, but which they are ultimately and tragically constantly having to pay for in the pursuit of selflessly helping other people, simply because they have the ability and therefore the obligation. Sometimes you mess up even when you have the greatest of intentions, and that's the classic but also depressing message of Spider-Man. Everything you do has consequences, the positive things and the negative things, and when you screw everything up, your only choice is to try to do the right thing again and hope for the best. But I'm making this whole chain reaction business sound like it's executed a lot more effectively than it really is. And that's the part I hate. The idea of a web of mystery that begins to unravel as soon as Peter starts yanking on a thread of it is really cool, perhaps visually symbolized when he plucks the strand in the laboratory at Oscorp and the fateful spider drops on his neck to bite him later. But it's extremely sloppily handled. In a movie all about cause and effect, choice and consequence, you'd really expect greater care to be taken in how the details of your story unfolds, so that it doesn't come off as an arbitrary set of convenient circumstances that all lead Peter exactly where the story needs him to go. Peter doesn't follow a path of breadcrumbs he discovers through his meticulous research that lead him to his father's work so that his father is indirectly responsible for creating Spider-Man, and then I get to gasp in awe at this new origin's originality. If only. It starts off okay. Peter finds his father's old briefcase in his uncle's basement. I can only assume he left that there for Peter to find someday, hoping he could show his son his life's work. Otherwise, it's a little strange that he left it there. Also, it's a good thing Richard Parker's middle initial isn't I, because Peter finding his father's briefcase labeled R.I.P. would have been incredibly awkward and a little morbid. Peter goes to Oscorp during an intern tour where his soon-to-be girlfriend just happens to be working. A somewhat unlikely coincidence, but not totally outside the realm of possibility. Peter is, after all, partially attracted to her because she is his intellectual equal, likely even smarter than he is, and so if there is a high school lead intern at Oscorp, that's probably who it would be. But then Peter just happens to bump into Osborn's right-hand lackey, who then just happens to drop a piece of paper with the double zeros printed on it Peter found in his father's notes. So Peter follows this guy to a room that conveniently has the double zeros printed outside of it, just so Peter knows he's in the right place and the guy isn't going somewhere totally unrelated, considering it's also pretty convenient that he just happens to have chosen that moment to go there instead of anywhere else in the building. And then Peter starts doing insanely dangerous things just because the story needs him to. He walks into a room filled with genetically engineered spiders. He plucks a strand of webbing like a guitar string just because it's there. Really? Peter's an unnecessary risk-taker, and he's not afraid of breaking rules, but seeing him go up against a school bully and ride a skateboard inside when a teacher tells him not to certainly isn't enough to make me buy that he would do this. And yes, he's here because he knows it has something to do with his father, but what the heck does he think standing inside a room of spiders is going to tell him about the math? And this is neither here nor there, but I don't understand the machine either. Why does touching a strand stop all the spinning turrets and drop spiders onto the floor? Sure hope nobody working there ever accidentally bumps into a web. Oscorp strikes me as the most dangerous place to work ever. Word to the wise, if that place is ever conducting clinical trials, do not volunteer, no matter how much they're paying. You don't want to end up turning into Bebop or Rocksteady. Spoiler alert, but they're actually already working on something like that. You know, come to think of it, Doc Connors reminds me more of Baxter Stockman than he does comic book Doc Connors. Or maybe I'm thinking of that guy who should have been Baxter Stockman from Ninja Turtles 2. Hey, maybe before Spider-Man took on the Lizard, he should have tried the traditional pre-fight donut. So while I think the motivations that lead Peter to Oscorp are believable, and I'm enjoying how it's over half an hour in before I'm seeing almost anything from the original film, the actual moment-to-moment events leading up to Peter getting the spider bite are a lot more implausible than the original scenario of he's on a class field trip, a spider gets out, and it picks him at random. It brings a silly degree of fate into the equation. The atmosphere of this scene screams, "This is your destiny!" Like, now that he's there, the universe itself is making darn sure he gets in that room to get bitten by a spider. If this were more of a story about destiny, that'd be one thing. But in this case, I feel like it's just a poorly thought out sequence of events. I mean, Ben has that line in the phone message where he says he thinks Peter is destined for greatness, but he says that because he believes in Peter's natural gifts and in his goodwill. And after we get the rest of his parents' story in the sequel about the specifics of how the spiders are genetically engineered, it actually comes off a lot more like a silly destiny thing. How hard would it have been to just let Peter uncover some other clues that lead him directly to that room so that he had a better sense of what he was looking for when he got there? And while we're on the subject of sloppy writing, just like in the first Raimi film, Peter performs a lot of extraordinary feats right in front of people that defy the laws of physics, and no one ever seems to react in the dumbfounded, mystified way I think real people probably would. It's about 3 times worse in this film because it keeps happening. It starts in the subway train. People seem a lot more concerned with Peter accidentally pulling a girl's shirt off than with the fact that he can hang upside down on the ceiling without grabbing a hold of anything. When he humiliates Flash Thompson on the basketball court, no one ever asks how in the world he's doing that trick with the ball, or how a kid his size could possibly perform that sort of dunk, let alone apply the force necessary to break the backboard. And how is no one investigating the kid who threw a football and put a massive dent in a goalpost? I thought it was hilarious that in the original film, nobody put 2 and 2 together when Spider-Man first starts showing up after a kid walks out of the cafeteria with webbing coming out of his wrist. But all of this is really unbelievable. I probably wouldn't be bugged so much by any one on their own, but all of these impossible things happening around Peter, somebody would be asking questions. For a movie that so desperately wants to find its own identity, kind of like Peter Parker himself. The sheer number of little details this film shares with the original is kind of interesting. I'll just share a few. Peter humiliates Flash Thompson with a dramatic display of superpowers. Connors argues with another personality in his head, just like Norman Osborn does. The line, "Great reflexes." Peter forgets to help paint the kitchen. Peter forgets to pick up Aunt May. The euphoric exploring powers in solitude scene, which leads up to the aforementioned irresponsible thing Peter realizes he forgot to do when he comes home late. An incredible costume Peter couldn't possibly afford. Peter refuses to stop a burglar to get retribution on someone after he's cheated in a really awkwardly conceived business transaction. The citizens of New York come together to help Spider-Man in the final confrontation. But as I said, the film generally goes out of its way to avoid being compared with the 2002 movie, which makes it, I think, a much different film than it otherwise might have been. The whole movie has a pretty muted color palette to make it feel moodier and more serious, which I think actually works tonally with the prevailing themes of loss and guilt, and the very dark direction Peter takes Spider-Man at first. And I actually like the design of the suit in that context. It looks a lot more grim and edgy than the traditional suit, especially when it's shot at night, and it seems to only look good in the dark, which may be why we really only see Spider-Man at night or when it's really overcast. It also helps it look less like it's made out of basketballs. Maybe the basketball scene is where he got the inspiration for what to make the costume out of. Since Peter's arc takes him from vigilante to hero in this film, I might have changed the visual tone by the third act to reflect that, but maybe we're still in the shadows to keep up that sense of sadness when Gwen's father dies, demonstrating that Spider-Man never gets a break. Or maybe the lizard CG just doesn't look good in sunlight either. One of the complaints I sometimes hear about this movie is that Uncle Ben doesn't explicitly say, with great power comes great responsibility. Yes, it kind of comes off like it's avoiding it, just because we heard it a lot last time around. But I actually think it's a bit more natural this way, and I like how it's worded here, that if you have the ability to do good things, you have a moral obligation to do those things. In the phone message at the end, Ben maybe gets a little too close to beating around the bush and nearly saying it, and then the whole "you're my hero" thing, I think, was laying it on a little thick. It just seemed unlikely that that's the thing Ben would say after Peter forgot to pick up his aunt, slammed the door, and ran away from home. Almost as if Ben had seen the rest of the movie and knew what kind of person Peter would become. But anyway, the problem I always had with the great responsibility line is the word power. It doesn't strike me as the natural thing a person would really say unless he knew you had superpowers. Or if he's going to say it, it would be a lot more natural if at least he maybe mentioned that he didn't dream up that nugget of wisdom, but that he's quoting the 18th century French philosopher Voltaire. And I, for one, actually like the omission of the wrestling because of the vigilante angle. The homage to it seemed a little too convenient, since Peter's looking at a poster of an almost Spider-Man mask just as thugs are yelling, "I know what you look like!" But to me, Peter creating Spider-Man to find Ben's killer, a purely selfish and guilt-inspired choice, takes the place of the wrestling persona. It gives the film a darker edge, but it never goes too far in that direction. Peter still isn't the Punisher or even Batman. I know I said I was hoping for something that kept the mood light, but ironically, while this Spider-Man starts off sort of darker, he never loses his sense of humor, and that's kept consistent throughout, while Maguire's Spider-Man was a mopier, more pathetic kind of insecure. But the visual tone was always overall lighter than this, and when he did make jokes, they came off as obligatory and often out of character. And then there was the whole ambiguous business of his maybe kind of accidentally killing the burglar and then going off and fighting crime and talking a lot about power and responsibility despite maybe actually getting revenge first, which is brought back to the forefront in Spider-Man 3. Maybe this version of Peter Parker actually isn't darker at all. And given the weird childhood Peter's had, just having his parents up and leave mysteriously and actually being an outcast because he can't relate to other kids for really specific reasons, rather than that typical generic nerdy and always bullied thing Maguire's Peter had, I both buy and appreciate Peter's initial lack of direction and the potential for darkness that he ultimately abandons when he realizes he can be something better. Interestingly, this Peter doesn't come up with the idea for Spider-Man until after his uncle's murder. He's looking for someone to blame, and he can't handle his own guilt, which strikes me as a lot more believable than he suddenly got the moral lesson Ben was trying to teach him immediately. Peter may at first glance seem like a really unsympathetic character, but the difference between sympathetic and unsympathetic narratively, isn't doing good stuff versus doing bad stuff. It's all about understanding why a character is the way he is based on his choices and experiences. And it's about giving him opportunities to change and seeing what he does with those. In this case, Peter does irresponsible stuff because he's suddenly infused with all this power and doesn't know where to focus it, much like nearly every supervillain origin ever. The universe finally seems to be throwing him a bone, and one of my favorite scenes in the movie is the montage where he's on top of the world after Gwen agrees to go out with him, swinging on chains and jumping impossibly high on a skateboard, completely forgetting that he promised to pick Aunt May up. That scene really resonated with me, partly because of the impeccable song selection, Coldplay's Till Kingdom Come, which was a hidden track on X and Y, and which was totally unknown to me before this movie. That song perfectly exemplifies Peter's entire state of mind, his waywardness, his grasping for purpose, his jubilation at finding someone who seems to get him, and who he has uncanny chemistry with. The wheels just keep on turning. The drummer begins to drum. I don't know which way I'm going. I don't know which way I've come. Hold my head inside your hands. I need someone who understands. I need someone who hears. For you, I've waited all these years. It's that incredible, exhilarating feeling of being completely lost, yet totally content all at the same time. That perfect moment that can't last, but that you never want to end. That total understanding of the most precious and fragile and fleeting moments of youth is why Marc Webb was perfect for this movie, and Andrew Garfield as well. Another major complaint often lobbed at the movie is that Peter completely drops his search for his uncle's killer and it's never mentioned again. I might agree that it would have been nice for some sort of verbal acknowledgement of why he's doing that, especially since by the time he stops looking for the burglar and he goes after the lizard, he has a confidant in Gwen Stacy. But I don't think it comes out of nowhere, and I think it's due to a conscious choice to live up to Uncle Ben's moral credo, his father's moral credo, after he encounters the lizard and saves the boy on the bridge, Jack. There's a whole lot going on in that scene. Peter saves a boy not only from certain doom, but from being separated from his father. That moment is perhaps more profound for Peter because it's a father and a son than had it been a girl and her mother. Before this, Peter was only Spider-Man to find his uncle's killer. Despite telling Captain Stacy he thinks Spider-Man is trying to help people. He's in denial about what he's really doing and for whom. But in this moment, Peter realizes what he can be and what that mask should represent. It's not just about keeping secrets now, it's about forging an identity. This is the moment in which he finally finds himself, that great opportunity for change. When he tells Jack to put the mask on, he creates the symbol Spider-Man stands for from then on, that symbol of responsibility, which Jack's father takes to heart in the third act. No matter who you are or what you look like, you have the ability to be strong and to be brave. It's that idea Stan Lee often talks about in interviews about the point of the full face mask. Any kid can imagine he's Spider-Man. Peter shows Jack that he's just a regular guy and he can be courageous, and so can Jack. By inspiring that kid, Peter is inspiring himself, and that's where I'm really loving the departure from the original origin. And in this case, it's why I don't have the same complaint that a lot of people do about all the Spider-Man movies, which is that Peter takes his mask off too often. Peter goes through a series of profound experiences that shape him, and instead of just being handed a code like Harry gives to Dexter, Peter gets the code first, and then begins to follow it only after he comes to appreciate its precepts firsthand. So he goes from selfish vigilante to selfless hero, and it's not a light switch. And then he follows the lizard, first because he's the only person who believes it exists and can do anything about it, and then because he realizes it's his personal responsibility. He had a hand in creating it. It would have been backtracking for his character arc if he ignored Connors and continued to pursue his uncle's killer, but on the other hand, this isn't Slade's skewed perspective of Oliver Queen's choice to let Shadow die over Sarah in Arrow or anything. Peter may have been able to stop the burglar, but he's not solely responsible for Ben's death. You'd think he'd still be actively trying to bring that guy to justice. It certainly needed some sort of closure. Peter's relationship with Gwen is the strongest element in the film. It's as if, when choosing directors, Sony looked at criticisms lobbed at the last series and said, we need a relationship guy. And so the weakest part about the Raimi films ironically becomes the best reason to watch these. Gwen Stacy is on the other side of the galaxy from Kirsten Dunst's Mary Jane in every conceivable way. She isn't shallow or petty, she's self-assured, she's spunky, she's talented and capable, and most importantly, we know immediately why she and Peter are enamored with each other. This is a relationship that makes perfect sense, both practically and psychologically. Peter is attracted to Gwen because, well, what remotely intelligent heterosexual male wouldn't be, but also because she represents all those things he's searching for in his life: purpose, direction. I like that there's a mutual admiration between them. Peter is drawn to her brilliance and confidence, and she's drawn to his innate heroism. And also, she'd be bored with anyone who couldn't match her intelligence. Gwen Stacy is tied with Pepper Potts for me right now as the best superhero love interest on film, and I like her and Peter together for some of the same reasons I like Tony and Pepper. Gwen is a good influence on Peter and helps to ground him. She's exactly what he needs right now, but it's not all give and no take. He isn't needy or pathetic, leaning on Gwen for everything. In fact, he tries to keep her away from the dangerous stuff, but he needs her because she's so capable, though that's to go get the cure at the end, which she has access to because she just happens to be the bad guy's lab assistant, so it's not all that impressive. I actually think the situation to get her involved in the superheroing is better handled in the sequel. I've said before that a lot of superheroes get involved with people who can't possibly understand what they do and why they take such monumental risks, and that incompatibility is often the driving force for the dramatic conflict, which to me isn't nearly as interesting as seeing the superhero date someone who can match him, maybe physically or intellectually or both. Gwen is Spider-Man's girlfriend and Alfred and Robin all in one. She's not just a stereotypical plot device there to get kidnapped. I like that we're teased about that when the Lizard is looking for her at Oscorp. When he finally finds her, he steals the compound she's trying to get away with but doesn't kidnap her. And I think Webb was making a point to build up that suspense and then psych us out, both because we expect every girl in a Spider-Man movie to get kidnapped by now, but also because it's Gwen Stacy, we kind of expect her to drop dead as soon as she's anywhere where a bad guy is involved. And because Gwen's father is a cop, and she's used to seeing that risky side of life, Gwen understands what Peter is doing, but she's also concerned for him and understandably trepidatious about getting serious with him, knowing she's in for a life of wondering whether he'll make it home. She doesn't whine about it or yank him around like she's bipolar. It's her internal conflict, and she ultimately chooses to take the risk. In the scene where she voices those concerns to Peter, she's realizing all at once that the thing that most drew her to him is the scariest part about dating him. But she also knows that that's the kind of person she'll always be drawn to. The psychology here is really sound, I think. Gwen is attracted to a man who reminds her of her father, who embodies all the qualities that she most admires about him. Perhaps there's a little of that going the other way, too. Peter's parents had an insatiable thirst for knowledge, which is Gwen to a T. Every time Gwen and Peter are on screen together, magic seems to happen. It's often the same sort of awkward, meandering, non-dialogue that Peter and MJ had in the Raimi movies, but Webb demonstrates here how to make those sorts of exchanges charming. Raimi had it right that that's how nervous teenagers sometimes communicate in situations like this, but his characters just didn't have the personality or the natural chemistry to pull it off. And I also like how assertive Gwen is. In a relationship like this, both parties can't be insecure and non-committal, or the relationship never sees any forward momentum. Gwen doesn't let Peter get away with jerking her around. In this movie's take on the I'm Batman scene, which mercifully comes pretty early in the film, Peter is waffling, unsure of how to let the cat out of the bag, and she starts to leave in a huff. Gwen is constantly challenging Peter and forcing him to step up, but it's not in that annoying, seductive, I'm a prize to be won sort of way. It's a self-respect thing. I'd like to briefly touch more on Dr. Connors, and I say briefly because sadly, there's just not as much to talk about here as there should be, and that's the biggest problem with this film. It knows how to do the teen character stuff, but then it gets to the bad guy and it freezes like so many other superhero movies. Instead of naturally integrating him into Peter's life, it uses his background with Richard Parker as an excuse to get him in here, and then totally misses the opportunity to do anything more with that. But at least he's not just turning into the Lizard at the same time Peter is turning into Spider-Man arbitrarily. I'm glad at least that stuff's related. Connors really should have been more of a father figure for Peter. He's his father's best friend and colleague, and he seems to share a lot of the same ideals with his father. Like Ra's al Ghul, the movie really seemed at first to be setting up a mentor figure for Peter, who turns out to be maybe a bad role model. With Ra's, it was his means justifies the ends philosophy. With Connors, it's his hubris, his belief that fixing mankind's problems is as easy as mastering a mathematical equation. It's all there, but the movie doesn't run with it, and Connors isn't nearly as present a figure in Peter's life after Ben's death as he should be. It might have been neat to get Peter emotionally closer to Connors so that he would have a reason to despise Norman Osborn later if he ever discovered that Osborn drove him to this and ruined his life. This is a movie about broken families, and one of the biggest missteps was cutting Connor's family out of the movie. There's an excellent deleted scene where Kurt tells his son he's going away for a while, echoing the flashback at the beginning with Peter and his father. I don't understand why you would cut that. People keep having to sacrifice what they most care about in the world for this research. The research that gave Peter powers and which will continue to cost him over and over again. Connor's family would have continued to compound that idea and would have gone a long way toward fully drawing this character and making his dream of regrowing his arm more personal and less generic. He's not altogether unsympathetic. I like the scenes where he's yearning for that cure, knowing he's so close. But beyond it just generally sucking to be missing your arm, I like more details about that to make a situation unique. Maybe there are things he could do with his son that he can't without his arm. Maybe this obsession with making a world without weakness is about his family. He doesn't like looking weak in front of them. Maybe he feels he isn't the strong, can do no wrong model for his son that he'd like to be. I do like that Connors and Peter both, in different ways, feel incomplete, and they're trying to make themselves whole again. And there's some throwaway stuff about how they're both outcasts, but those connections are all way too far in the background. This is such a good mainstream teen drama that sometimes the superhero stuff kind of gets in the way. Character-wise, the actual origin is the best part, as Peter learning how to use his powers and what to use them for serves as a good metaphor for puberty and for those daunting life choices you have to make in order to forge your own identity when you're a teenager. But once that third act hits, it turns into the typical superhero action spectacle. The sudden ginormous scale seems to be at odds tonally with the character piece of the first two acts. Everything comes together okay. Peter stops the lizard, which was his responsibility. A bunch of construction workers come together to help him get to the tower, which represents the positive message he's inspiring in the city. And Captain Stacy gets killed in order to drive home the point that there are always going to be consequences to being a hero. But did we really need an overblown turn everybody into lizards plot to accomplish all of this? Sure, Connors wants to create a world without weakness, but as soon as he's made so desperate that he feels the need to steal his own compound and inject himself with it, he stops being Kurt Connors at all, and he turns into this whole other insane character, as evidenced by his lucidity and his grief over what he's done once he gets the cure and he's turned human again at the end. I suppose the idea here is that he becomes the ultimate symbol of irresponsibility. Peter stands for doing the hard thing, risking his life to stop Connors, giving up Gwen at the end, while the lizard thinks he can solve every problem with an easy fix. You can't get rid of human weakness because, as we see throughout Peter's arc, people require weakness, require adversity to strive over, to become better. The lizard DNA makes you faster and stronger and you can regrow limbs, but it also makes you a lot more aggressive, taking away that sense of responsibility and drive for self-improvement and your regard for other human life. And Connor says it also makes you smarter. Really? Smarter? He didn't really seem any smarter to me, and isn't the spider bite Peter got basically the same serum, but it works properly? Did it make Peter smarter? But anyway, I think this whole idea would have played out just as well if Connors, in his desperation, simply turned into a giant lizard without a brain and wreaked havoc across the city. You still would have had a spectacular fight, but it wouldn't feel like it's suddenly gotta be a big take-over-the-world plot just because it's a comic book thing and we're worried we're cheating audiences if we don't give them that. He really just is a big crazy monster, except he has a psychotic plan to turn everybody else into big crazy monsters and seems to have derived his scheme from watching the first X-Men movie. Some of my difficulty with the turn everyone into lizards move comes from execution. So Connors has this Genali device that can disperse any chemical agent into the air, but he's not allowed to patent it because of the obvious horrifying implications. Okay, then why is he allowed to have it in the lab? If it's an abandoned project, why is it always turned on? I guess because the lizard is going to need it later and we have to buy that he was able to immediately plug it in and use it. Okay, and I don't like how Captain Stacy is suddenly thrown under the bus. The movie has gone out of its way to make him a little more than the stereotypical concerned parent or the stereotypical cop who hates the vigilante hero. I was really impressed with the choice to have Stacy check into Kurt Connors directly after telling Peter he's out of his mind and doesn't believe him about the lizard. This guy is behaving surprisingly reasonably. But then the last act has to ruin all of that by having Stacy chase after Spider-Man when there's a giant lizard trying to transform the whole city. Stacy knows that Connors has released a biological agent, and he seems to have every available cop and SWAT team officer going after Spider-Man. Really? Then, after he finds out Peter is Spider-Man and decides to help him, Stacy is the only cop who shows up at Oscorp to help Spider-Man fight the lizard. What? Why? Spider-Man didn't lay out every single cop, and even if he had, how long does it take to wake up from getting knocked unconscious? Clearly, this is just a plot convenience to make it easier for the lizard to kill Stacy, and so Spider-Man can save the day single-handedly. While I like the payoff of the dad on the bridge helping Spider-Man in some way, yeah, the way he gets all those cranes lined up is pretty unlikely. But also, these guys have no idea what Spider-Man knows about the lizard or what he's planning. We're using that goofy logic where we know we're in a superhero movie, so just because he's the guy wearing the tights, we gotta help him get to the bad guy because he's the only one who can save us. See, look, I saw the opening credits and his name's in the title. One of the really cool ideas in the film is that the never-seen but always eerily present Norman Osborn is the real villain of the piece. He's the other side of the viewpoint Peter comes to embody. Everyone else is a means to an end, a cog in a machine, designed only to keep Osborn alive. Connors is just one in a long line of unfortunate victims in Osborn's pursuit of a cure, and considering the research, maybe even immortality. I like that the Oscorp building has a beehive pattern going all the way up it. His employees are just expendable drones who only exist to keep their master alive. Finally, I should probably weigh in on that confounding line the movie ends on, which I think helped sour a lot of folks on the movie at large. In trying to honor Captain Stacy's last wishes, Peter is staying away from Gwen. He doesn't go to the funeral, and when she comes to his house to confront him about it, he can't bring himself to say anything, which, in another context, might bug me. Sometimes that's forced dramatic tension by contriving stupid reasons for characters not to communicate. There was a lot of that in the original trilogy. But in this case, it works because Peter is trying to live up to a promise, but at the same time, doesn't want to turn Gwen against her father after that tragedy. But then in class, Peter promises his teacher he won't be late again, and she says, "Don't make promises you can't keep." And then Peter has that now infamous line to Gwen, "But those are the best kind." The first time I saw the film, I scratched my head at that too, but the more I've mulled over it, I think I might have a handle on what it's getting at. It is a strange line to leave us with, and it bothers me that I had to see the film 4 or 5 times to come up with this. And I don't even know if I'm right about it. I don't think Peter is saying, "I've changed my mind and I'm going to disregard your father's request because we just have too much chemistry and there's no way we can stay away from each other." They're in class together. They go to the same school. They can't possibly completely stay away from each other. And because Peter is in love and it's breaking him up that they can't be together, it's, I think, his way of saying at least there's this unavoidable loophole. We still get to see each other because circumstances will continue to force us together and it's not our fault. So I'm still not going against the promise I made. That's kind of romantic and sad, and I don't think it makes him less sympathetic. We'll, of course, revisit this whole thing when we get to Amazing Spider-Man 2, but I'm more comfortable with that line in the context of this movie than I was when I first saw it. As much as I enjoy the first 2 Raimi movies, I think Marc Webb has a much better handle on the nuances of high school life, and his take on Peter's search for identity and the way he learns the Stan Lee lesson of responsibility and self-sacrifice unfolds more convincingly and is more compelling than the way Raimi handled it. But I can't say the comic book stuff is any more entertaining. In some other parallel reality, I'd like to see what Webb's vision would be without the legacy and baggage of the previous trilogy. I feel a little odd giving this film the same score as I gave Raimi's first movie, and perhaps I was a bit too lenient when I scored that one. I actually want to like it a lot more, as I feel like it surpasses its predecessor in characterization and relationships. But Connors isn't nearly realized enough, and a lot of the story's actual plot hinges on a lot of silly happenstance. I'm giving The Amazing Spider-Man a 3 out of 4.